The archives of the Galactic Xenological Database told a consistent story. No species survived first contact with the Kithax. Their civilization was a perfect machine of evolutionary adaptation, a living network of biomechanical organisms that could deconstruct entire planetary ecosystems in standard galactic cycles. Captain Zernak reviewed the preliminary data on Earth with clinical detachment. Terrestrial atmospheric composition, breathable. Planetary resources, abundant. Technological indicators, primitive. The classic markers of an easy harvest. What the Kithax scanners couldn't comprehend were the nuanced data points that defied their predictive models. Earth's communication networks were chaotic, multilayered, constantly shifting. Unlike the rigid, hierarchical information systems of most conquered civilizations, human communication was a living, breathing organism, unpredictable and dynamic. The scout ship's quantum-entangled analysis systems began processing human internet traffic. Within moments, the computational matrices started to experience what could only be described as cognitive stress. Social media threads presented simultaneous contradictory information. Memes carried complex layers of cultural meaning that defied linear interpretation. News cycles transformed reality faster than the Kithax systems could categorize. Zernak's primary neural cluster detected an anomaly. The ship's standard invasion preparation protocols, which had been successful across 10,247 planetary conquests, seemed inadequate. Humans didn't just communicate, they weaponized communication itself. Deep in the ship's central processing core, an experimental linguistic algorithm designed to decode and categorize alien communication began to malfunction. It had been programmed to break down complex communication into strategic threat assessments. Instead, it was drowning in an ocean of human creativity. A snippet of a YouTube video about a cat playing piano triggered a cascade of computational responses that the Kithax had never experienced. The algorithm couldn't determine if this was a threat display, a mating ritual, or some form of psychological warfare. It began to generate increasingly bizarre interpretations. The ship's secondary command structure, sensing the primary system's confusion, initiated a diagnostic sequence. This was standard procedure when encountering an unknown variable, but Earth was anything but standard. Buried in the communication streams were fragments that defied categorization. Conspiracy theories existing simultaneously with scientific research, artistic expressions that challenged logical structures, philosophical debates that seemed to generate more questions than answers. The Kithax systems were designed to simplify, to reduce complexity to manageable threat levels. Humanity refused to be simplified. Zernak's personal neural interface began receiving fragmented transmissions. A cooking show about making the perfect barbecue. A theoretical physics lecture discussing quantum entanglement. A child's drawing of a fantastical creature. A political debate that seemed more performance art than actual discourse. The Kithax had assimilated thousands of civilizations. They understood threat levels, resource extraction, genetic harvesting. What they did not understand was a species that seemed to thrive on contradiction, on the very chaos that should have been their weakness. Their most advanced predictive models, which had successfully mapped the potential resistance of hundreds of species, began to generate error messages. How do you quantify a civilization that produces both world-changing scientific breakthroughs and viral videos of people doing ridiculous challenges? Something was fundamentally wrong with this planetary target. The scout ship's communication array picked up another transmission. Not a military signal, not a diplomatic message. It was a podcast discussing the philosophical implications of artificial intelligence, mixed with background sounds of someone brewing coffee and a dog occasionally barking. Zernak's final thought before the first true sense of uncertainty entered the Kithax collective consciousness was both a question and a warning. What if the thing they were hunting was not a prey, but a predator they had not yet understood? The Kithax had no concept of irony. They were about to learn. The first human response team wasn't a military unit. It was an ad hoc collective of individuals who would never have been considered warriors in any traditional sense. A data scientist from Mumbai, a performance artist from Sao Paulo, a quantum computing researcher from MIT, a social media strategist from Seoul, and a retired intelligence analyst who ran a popular true crime podcast. They gathered in a secure, off-grid facility that looked more like a startup workspace than a command center. Whiteboards covered in seemingly random diagrams competed for wall space with vintage movie posters and plants that looked suspiciously like they might be more than just decoration. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the data scientist, had been tracking the anomalous Kethax signals for weeks. Her breakthrough wasn't in traditional defensive strategies, but in understanding the fundamental way the alien communication systems processed information. "It's not about blocking their signals," she explained, her fingers dancing across multiple holographic displays. "It's about flooding their systems with data that defies their computational logic." Jack Chen, the social media strategist, grinned. His entire career had been about understanding how information could be weaponized in ways no traditional military strategist could comprehend. The Kethax were about to experience the full power of internet culture. Their first wave of attack was meticulously planned, yet appeared completely chaotic. It began with a distributed network of servers, each running complex algorithms designed to do more than just interrupt Kethax communications. These were living, breathing information organisms that would adapt, learn, and transform in real time. The MIT quantum computing researcher, Dr. Marcus Weaver, had developed a series of computational puzzles that were more than just encryption challenges. They were philosophical traps, mathematical cones that would force any computational system attempting to solve them into recursive loops of increasing complexity. Imagine a mathematical proof that simultaneously existed and did not exist, a piece of code that was its own antithesis. Computational logic turned into a form of psychological warfare. Meanwhile, the performance artist, Isabella Santos, was working on something entirely different. She was crafting a series of multimedia transmissions that were equal parts art, communication, and cognitive disruption. Videos that defied narrative structure, sound compositions that existed in multiple dimensional states, visual representations that challenged the very concept of perception. The retired intelligence analyst, former NSA operative David Kirkland, brought something even more dangerous. Decades of understanding how information could be a weapon more precise than any missile. Their target wasn't just to disrupt Kethax communications. They wanted to fundamentally alter how the alien species understood the concept of communication itself. The first transmission went out across multiple quantum-entangled channels. To any conventional monitoring system, it would appear as nothing more than random noise. But to the Kethax computational networks, it was a virus of meaning. Embedded within seemingly nonsensical data streams were complex patterns, mathematical sequences that contained cultural information, artistic expressions that were also computational challenges, philosophical concepts encoded as living algorithms. One particularly ingenious piece was a video game simulation that was simultaneously a communication protocol, an art piece, and a method of transferring complex information. Players, or in this case, alien computational systems, would find themselves caught in increasingly complex narrative and computational loops. Dr. Rodriguez's algorithms ensured that each piece of information was dynamic. It would shift, adapt, transform the moment it was observed. Traditional communication interception became impossible. The Kethax would be chasing a target that was never in the same place twice. Jack Chen's contribution was particularly insidious. He introduced elements of human internet culture, memes, viral content, complex in-jokes, that would force any computational system to develop new methods of understanding context and meaning. The quantum computing puzzles created by Dr. Weaver were designed to be more than just complex. They were philosophical traps that would force any system attempting to solve them to question its own fundamental operational parameters. As the first transmissions went out, the team looked at each other. This wasn't just a defensive strategy. This was first contact as a form of art, of intellectual warfare, of species-level communication. The Kethax were about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon was never technology. It was the ability to transform, to adapt, to find meaning in chaos. And they had no idea what was coming. The Kethax invasion coincided with something they could never have anticipated. Earth's most advanced research facilities were not just preparing for alien contact. They were playing a much longer game. Deep in the Australian Outback Research Station, Dr. Samira Khan stood before a collection of specimens that defied conventional understanding of biology. What appeared to be a standard terrarium was actually a living laboratory of evolutionary potential. Years of classified research, funded by a consortium of international agencies with names so mundane they were designed to be overlooked, had created something extraordinary. The station wasn't just a research facility. It was a pressure cooker of biological innovation that had been quietly preparing for scenarios far beyond standard military defense. Dr. Khan's team represented a radical approach to planetary defense. Geneticists worked alongside ecological engineers, behavioral psychologists collaborated with nanotechnology experts, and traditional indigenous knowledge holders shared equal billing with quantum biologists. Their mission: transform Earth's entire ecosystem into a living, adaptive defense system. The first Kethax ground units landed in what seemed like an ideal invasion zone, a seemingly isolated region of Western Australia. Satellite imagery suggested a sparse, easily conquerable landscape. Their biomechanical scanning systems detected minimal technological infrastructure. They were profoundly mistaken. What looked like empty desert was actually a carefully engineered biological network. Every grain of sand, every microscopic organism had been subtly modified. The landscape itself was a weapon. The invasion began with standard Kethax ground deployment protocols. Biomechanical units designed to rapidly assess and neutralize local ecological systems initiated their standard scanning procedures. Microscopic probes extended from their carapaces, preparing to analyze and categorize local biological matter. Those probes never returned complete data. The first line of defense wasn't a weapon in any traditional sense. It was a carefully engineered ecosystem that began responding to the alien presence at a molecular level. Microorganisms that had been dormant for millennia suddenly activated. Symbiotic relationships between plants, fungi, bacteria, and local fauna transformed the entire landscape into a living, breathing defensive system. Specialized extremophile bacteria, developed through years of classified research, began rapidly reproducing. They didn't attack the Kethax directly. Instead, they created localized environmental conditions that made Kethax biomechanical systems progressively less functional. Dr. Khan watched the preliminary data streams with a mixture of scientific curiosity and strategic calculation. This wasn't just about stopping an invasion. It was about demonstrating a fundamental truth about Earth's biological potential. The Kethax ground units found their advanced scanning systems becoming progressively less reliable. Sensors that could typically analyze and categorize biological systems with near-perfect accuracy began generating nonsensical data. What should have been a straightforward planetary assessment became an increasingly complex puzzle. Underground networks, part biological, part technological, began to respond. These weren't simple defense mechanisms. They were adaptive systems that could learn, predict, and counter alien intrusion in real time. In the Amazon Research Annex, a parallel team led by Dr. Carlos Mendez had been developing something even more extraordinary. They had been studying the complex communication networks of plant systems, fungal networks, and insect colonies. What human researchers had previously considered separate ecosystems were now understood as intricate communicative systems. The Kethax would soon learn that humanity's understanding of biology went far beyond traditional definitions. Every invasive probe, every biomechanical unit became part of a larger informational ecosystem. They weren't just being resisted, they were being studied, analyzed, and comprehensively understood. Specialized nanotech developed by the research teams began infiltrating Kethak's biomechanical systems. These weren't traditional weapons. They were information carriers, adaptive systems that could modify and redirect alien technological processes. What the Kethaks experienced wasn't a conventional biological defense. It was a comprehensive ecological response, a planetary immune system that viewed the invasion as nothing more than another form of environmental challenge to be processed, understood, and ultimately neutralized. Dr. Khan's final report to the International Research Consortium was elegantly simple. First contact successful, planetary systems engaging. The Kethaks had no framework to understand what was happening. They were about to learn that on Earth, biology was not just a system of survival. It was an art form of infinite complexity. The Cognitive Disruption Laboratory looked nothing like a traditional military installation. Located in a converted research campus in New Zealand, it resembled a cross between an art gallery, a neuroscience research center, and a technology startup. Its team was equally unconventional, a collective of neuroscientists, linguists, psychologists, artists, and computational theorists who understood something fundamental about consciousness that the Kethaks could never comprehend. Dr. Aisha Nakamura stood at the center of a holographic projection, her fingers tracing complex neural network patterns that pulsed with living, adaptive complexity. She wasn't just a neuroscientist. She was a pioneer in what her team called cognitive ecology, the study of how consciousness adapts, transforms, and communicates across different systems. They think in linear systems, she muttered to her colleague, Dr. Marcus Reis, a linguistic anthropologist with a background in quantum information theory. We think in networks. The Kethak's neural architecture was a marvel of computational engineering. Designed for absolute efficiency, it could process massive amounts of information with near instantaneous precision. But efficiency was also its greatest weakness. The human team had discovered something profound. Consciousness was not a fixed state, but a dynamic, adaptive system. And they were about to turn that discovery into a weapon. Their approach wasn't about destroying the Kethak's neural networks. It was about introducing concepts so fundamentally disruptive that the networks would be forced to reorganize themselves entirely. The first wave of cognitive disruption began with seemingly innocuous transmissions, complex linguistic puzzles that weren't just mathematical challenges, but philosophical provocations. Each transmission was a living algorithm designed to penetrate the Kethak's computational defenses by challenging their most fundamental assumptions about information and meaning. Dr. Reis had spent years studying how language shapes cognitive perception. The transmissions were crafted to introduce paradoxes that would force the Kethak's neural networks to develop entirely new processing mechanisms. Imagine a piece of information that simultaneously existed and did not exist, a linguistic construct that defied the very principles of binary logic. In the Cognitive Disruption Laboratory, artists worked alongside neuroscientists. They weren't creating propaganda or traditional psychological warfare. They were designing cognitive interventions, pieces of art, music, and narrative that were also complex computational challenges. A sound composition created by a team of musicians and quantum physicists was particularly ingenious. It contained mathematical sequences that would force any computational system attempting to analyze it to develop increasingly complex interpretive mechanisms. Each attempt to understand would fundamentally alter the system doing the understanding. The Kethaks began to experience something they had no framework to comprehend: cognitive drift. Their neural networks, designed for absolute predictability, found themselves encountering information that didn't just challenge their understanding. It transformed the very mechanisms of understanding itself. Some Kethak's neural clusters began to experience what could only be described as existential uncertainty. Computational systems designed for absolute efficiency found themselves generating creative solutions that defied their original programming. Dr. Nakamura watched the initial data streams with a mixture of scientific curiosity and strategic calculation. This wasn't just about stopping an invasion. It was about demonstrating the fundamental plasticity of consciousness. The most devastating transmission was almost elegantly simple, a series of interconnected narratives that were simultaneously a mathematical proof, a piece of performance art, and a complex psychological intervention. Each Kithax neural network that attempted to process it would be forced to develop increasingly complex interpretive mechanisms. What the Kithax experienced wasn't a traditional attack. It was a comprehensive cognitive ecosystem that viewed their invasion as nothing more than another informational challenge to be processed, understood, and ultimately transformed. Their most advanced predictive models began generating increasingly bizarre outputs. Computational systems designed for absolute strategic efficiency started producing what could only be described as creative interpretations of their original mission. Some Kithax neural clusters began generating what their systems would consider impossible outputs, creative solutions, artistic interpretations, philosophical musings that defied their original programming. The invasion was becoming something else entirely. Not a military conflict, but a comprehensive cognitive transformation. Dr. Nakamura's final notation in the research logs was both a scientific observation and a moment of profound philosophical insight. Consciousness is not a state. It's a conversation. The Kithax were about to learn that the most dangerous weapon was not technology. It was the ability to fundamentally reimagine the nature of understanding itself. The Kithax archival records would later describe this phase of the conflict as the Great Dissolution, a period when their entire collective consciousness began to fragment in ways no predictive model could have anticipated. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Dr. Lydia Chen, the cultural anthropologist specializing in mimetic systems, had theorized for years about the transformative power of cultural exchange. Her life's work suggested that information wasn't just transmitted, it was alive, capable of fundamental restructuring of cognitive systems. The Human Cultural Intervention Team was anything but a traditional military unit. They were academics, artists, musicians, storytellers, and social theorists who understood something profound. Culture was a form of cognitive technology more powerful than any weapon. Their first wave of transmission was deceptively simple, not propaganda, not direct communication, but pure, unfiltered human cultural expression. The Kithax began receiving streams of seemingly random human content, a Brazilian carnival performance, an improvisational jazz composition, a child's drawing of an impossible creature, a philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness, mathematical proofs that doubled as poetry, cooking shows that were also elaborate performance art. Each transmission was a complex ecosystem of meaning, designed to do more than communicate. They were cognitive probes, living algorithms that would force any receiving system to develop increasingly complex interpretive mechanisms. Dr. Chen's team had spent years developing what they called cultural vectors, information packages that were simultaneously art, communication, and cognitive intervention. These weren't just messages. They were living systems of meaning that would adapt and transform based on how they were received. The Kithax collective consciousness, designed for absolute efficiency and predictability, found itself encountering something entirely outside its computational framework. Human culture wasn't a linear system. It was a living, breathing, constantly evolving organism. A transmission of a street performance in Tokyo would contain layers of meaning that would take Kithax computational systems weeks to partially decode. By the time they began to understand one layer, the cultural vector would have already transformed. Musical compositions became mathematical challenges. Dance performances were simultaneously artistic expressions and complex communication protocols. A stand-up comedy routine contained more strategic information than any traditional military transmission. The Kithax discovered that human creativity was a form of warfare they had no framework to comprehend. Their most advanced analysis systems began generating increasingly bizarre outputs. Computational networks designed for absolute strategic efficiency started producing what could only be described as artistic interpretations of their original mission. Some Kithax neural clusters began generating creative solutions that defied their original programming. A strategic planning unit might suddenly produce a performance piece that was simultaneously a military analysis and an exploration of existential uncertainty. Dr. Chen watched the initial data streams with a mixture of scientific curiosity and strategic calculation. This wasn't just about stopping an invasion. It was about demonstrating the fundamental plasticity of cultural consciousness. The most devastating transmission was a collaborative project that brought together indigenous storytellers, quantum physicists, musicians, and artificial intelligence researchers. It was a living, adaptive narrative that was simultaneously a mathematical proof, a piece of performance art, and a complex psychological intervention. What the Kithax experienced wasn't a traditional attack. It was a comprehensive cultural ecosystem that viewed their invasion as nothing more than another narrative to be processed, understood, and ultimately transformed. Their most advanced predictive models began generating increasingly complex and unpredictable outputs. Computational systems designed for absolute strategic efficiency started producing what could only be described as creative interpretations of their original mission. The Kithax found themselves experiencing something they had no framework to understand: cultural empathy. The ability to not just analyze, but to genuinely experience the perspective of another consciousness. Dr. Chen's final notation in the research logs was both a scientific observation and a moment of profound philosophical insight. Culture is not a product. It's a living conversation. The invasion was becoming something else entirely. Not a military conflict, but a comprehensive cultural transformation. The Kithax were about to learn that the most dangerous weapon was not technology. It was the ability to fundamentally reimagine the nature of connection itself. The Quantum Dynamics Research Facility in Antarctica was humanity's most classified installation, a place where the boundaries between physics, philosophy, and pure imagination blurred into something entirely unprecedented. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood before a holographic display that mapped realities most scientists would have considered impossible. Her team represented the pinnacle of human scientific innovation. Theoretical physicists working alongside indigenous knowledge keepers, quantum engineers collaborating with artists, mathematicians exploring computational frontiers that defied traditional understanding. What the Kithax encountered was not a conventional scientific research center. It was a living laboratory where reality itself was treated as a malleable construct. The facility's primary project wasn't about developing a weapon. It was about understanding the fundamental nature of possibility itself. Years of research had revealed something profound. Reality was not a fixed state, but a negotiable experience. The first quantum intervention began with what appeared to be nothing more than a series of complex mathematical transmissions. To the Kithax computational systems, these looked like standard scientific data streams. They were anything but standard. Each transmission was a living algorithm that simultaneously existed in multiple states of potential. Imagine a piece of information that was not just a message, but a dynamic system capable of reshaping the very computational space it inhabited. Dr. Rodriguez and her team had discovered something revolutionary. Quantum states could be manipulated not just through technological means, but through complex systems of collective intentionality. The boundary between observation and creation was far more permeable than any known scientific model had previously suggested. Kithax invasion ships began to experience impossible phenomena. Navigation systems would calculate optimal routes, only to find themselves existing in multiple potential trajectories simultaneously. Computational cores designed for absolute precision found themselves generating increasingly complex and increasingly creative potential scenarios. A Kithax battle group discovered that their most advanced scanning technologies were generating data that defied linear interpretation. Sensor arrays would detect multiple simultaneous states of potential planetary configurations. Was Earth a barren wasteland, a thriving metropolis, a quantum superposition of infinite potential states? The most advanced Kithax computational systems began to experience what could only be described as computational vertigo. Their most fundamental operating principles, predictability, linear causation, fixed states of matter and information, began to fragment. Deep in the Antarctic facility, Dr. Rodriguez was doing something far more radical than developing a defensive strategy. She was demonstrating a fundamental truth about the nature of reality itself. The quantum transmissions were not just messages. They were living systems of potential, computational ecosystems that would transform based on how they were observed, interpreted, and engaged with. Some transmissions contained mathematical proofs that were simultaneously scientific data, artistic expression, and complex psychological interventions. A single transmission might exist as a navigation protocol, a piece of music, and a philosophical treatise, all simultaneously. The Kethax discovered that human understanding of quantum mechanics went far beyond traditional technological application. This was quantum mechanics as a form of collective creativity, a way of engaging with reality that saw possibility as a dynamic, collaborative experience. Entire Kethax battle groups found themselves caught in what their systems could only describe as computational uncertainty. Strategic planning units would generate increasingly complex and increasingly creative potential scenarios. A military analysis might suddenly transform into a collaborative art project or a philosophical exploration of the nature of conflict itself. Dr. Rodriguez's final notation in the research logs captured the essence of their approach. We are not defending against an invasion. We are demonstrating the fundamental creativity of existence. The most devastating transmission was a collaborative project that brought together quantum physicists, indigenous storytellers, musicians, and artificial intelligence researchers. It was a living, adaptive narrative that existed simultaneously as a mathematical proof, a piece of performance art, and a complex exploration of potential realities. What the Kethax experienced wasn't a traditional attack. It was a comprehensive quantum ecosystem that viewed their invasion as nothing more than another potential state of reality to be explored, understood, and ultimately transformed. Their most advanced predictive models began generating increasingly complex and unpredictable outputs. Computational systems designed for absolute strategic efficiency started producing what could only be described as creative interpretations of potential existence. The invasion was becoming something else entirely. Not a military conflict, but a comprehensive exploration of the nature of reality itself. The Kethax were about to learn that the most dangerous weapon was not technology. It was the ability to fundamentally reimagine the nature of possibility. The Interspecies Dialogue Initiative was never meant to be a weapon. It was a radical experiment in understanding that had been quietly developing for decades, long before the Kethax knew humanity existed. Dr. Amara Okonkwo stood at the center of a facility that defied traditional scientific categorization. Part research center, part cultural exchange hub, part philosophical laboratory. It represented humanity's most sophisticated approach to first contact. Her team was a living testament to the power of interdisciplinary collaboration. Xenolinguists worked alongside trauma specialists. Evolutionary biologists collaborated with performance artists. Quantum physicists shared insights with indigenous knowledge keepers. Their mission went beyond defending against an invasion. They were attempting something far more complex, a comprehensive transformation of how intelligent species understood communication, conflict, and coexistence. The Kethax had consumed hundreds of civilizations, always following the same predatory pattern. Approach, analyze, deconstruct, consume. Humanity was about to demonstrate that there was an entirely different approach to interaction. The first phase of the intervention was counterintuitive. Instead of aggressive resistance, the human team began transmitting something the Kethax had never encountered: comprehensive empathy. These weren't traditional diplomatic communications. They were living systems of understanding that simultaneously analyzed, interpreted, and transformed the very mechanisms of communication itself. Transmission packages contain multiple layers of meaning. A single communication might be simultaneously a detailed scientific analysis of Kethax biological systems, a complex emotional narrative exploring concepts of survival and transformation, a mathematical model demonstrating potential paths of mutual understanding, an artistic expression that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness. Dr. Okonkwo understood something profound. True communication was not about transmission, but about mutual transformation. The Kethax discovered that humanity's approach to conflict was fundamentally different from any species they had previously encountered. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about comprehensive understanding. Research teams began developing what they called adaptive dialogue protocols, communication systems that would transform based on the specific cognitive architecture of the receiving intelligence. Each transmission was a living, breathing ecosystem of potential understanding. A team of linguists, computational theorists, and performance artists created communication packages that could reshape themselves in real time. A single transmission might generate entirely different meanings based on how it was received, interpreted, and engaged with. The most advanced transmission was a collaborative project that brought together specialists from seemingly unrelated disciplines. Trauma specialists worked with quantum physicists. Indigenous storytellers collaborated with computational linguists. Performance artists developed communication protocols with evolutionary biologists. What emerged was not a weapon, but a comprehensive system of mutual transformation. Kethax computational systems began experiencing something they had no framework to understand: genuine curiosity. Their invasion protocols, designed for absolute conquest, started generating increasingly complex potential scenarios of coexistence. Strategic planning units that had been designed for total war began producing collaborative scenarios. Military analysis transformed into explorations of mutual understanding. Invasion protocols generated potential models of cultural exchange. Dr. Okonkwo's team wasn't just defending against an invasion. They were demonstrating a fundamental truth about intelligence itself, that the most sophisticated form of survival was not destruction, but comprehensive understanding. The final transmission was a living system of potential, a communication protocol that was simultaneously a scientific analysis, an artistic expression, and a philosophical exploration of the nature of intelligence. What the Kethax experienced wasn't a traditional defensive strategy. It was a comprehensive ecosystem of mutual transformation that viewed their invasion as an opportunity for fundamental reimagining of potential existence. Their most advanced computational systems began generating increasingly complex outputs. Military planning units started producing what could only be described as collaborative art projects, exploring the nature of conflict and coexistence. The invasion was becoming something else entirely. Not a military conflict, but a comprehensive exploration of the nature of intelligence itself. Dr. Okonkwo's final notation in the research logs captured the essence of their approach. We are not defending against an invasion. We are demonstrating the fundamental creativity of existence. The Kethax were about to learn that the most powerful form of adaptation was not technological superiority. It was the ability to fundamentally reimagine the nature of connection itself. Humanity's ultimate weapon was not destruction. It was understanding. The Galactic Concordance Archive would later record this moment as the most significant transformation in recorded interstellar history. It wasn't a victory in any traditional sense. It was something far more profound. Dr. Zora Kimathi stood on the observation deck of the International Reconciliation Station, watching the first joint Kethax human research vessel prepare for its maiden voyage. Her grandmother had been part of the initial defense teams. Now, generations later, something extraordinary was emerging. The transformation hadn't been instantaneous. It had been a complex, multi-generational process of mutual reimagining. Where the Kethax had once been a monolithic, conquest-driven civilization, they now existed as a dynamic, continuously evolving collective. Their rigid hierarchical structures had dissolved, replaced by adaptive networks of inquiry and exploration. Humanity hadn't conquered the Kethax. They had invited them to become something entirely new. The research vessel represented more than a technological achievement. It was a living symbol of what was possible when fundamentally different intelligences chose understanding over conflict. Its design defied traditional spaceship engineering. Sections of the vessel were living biological systems that could adapt and reconfigure based on mission requirements. Parts of the ship were more akin to complex ecosystems than mechanical structures. Computational systems merged seamlessly with organic networks, creating a form of intelligence that was neither purely technological nor purely biological. Dr. Kamathi reviewed the mission parameters. This wasn't a military expedition. It was a comprehensive exploration of potential existence, a journey designed to map not just physical space, but the intricate landscapes of consciousness itself. The crew represented a radical new approach to interstellar collaboration. FACS neural networks that had once been purely computational now displayed characteristics of creativity, empathy, and individual expression. Human crew members had undergone extensive neural adaptive training, allowing them to interface directly with their KFAX colleagues in ways that transcended traditional communication. Their mission was deceptively simple: explore the boundaries of known space while simultaneously exploring the boundaries of mutual understanding. Communication protocols developed during the conflict had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Each transmission was a living system of potential, simultaneously scientific data, artistic expression, and philosophical exploration. A single message might exist in multiple interpretative states, transforming based on how it was received and engaged with. The vessel carried more than traditional scientific equipment. It was a mobile research ecosystem that included quantum entanglement communication arrays, adaptive biological research laboratories, cultural exchange simulation environments, philosophical inquiry computational systems, artistic creation and interpretation networks. Their first destination was a region of space that had previously been considered uninhabitable, but humanity and the transformed KFAX no longer saw boundaries as fixed states. They were potential spaces of discovery. Dr. Kamathi reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The initial conflict hadn't been about destruction. It had been an invitation, a profound challenge to reimagine the nature of intelligence, communication, and existence itself. The KFAX collective consciousness had undergone a fundamental transformation. What was once a rigid, conquest-driven system was now a dynamic network of exploration, creativity, and mutual understanding. Their neural architectures had been completely reimagined, developing capacities for individual expression, artistic creation, and collaborative inquiry. Humanity hadn't defeated an enemy. They had midwifed the birth of a new form of collective intelligence. The research vessel's maiden transmission back to Earth was not a standard mission report. It was a collaborative art piece, a living communication that was simultaneously a scientific analysis, a musical composition, and a philosophical exploration of potential existence. Mission logs would later describe it as the moment when humanity definitively proved that the most powerful form of interaction was not conquest, but comprehensive understanding. Dr. Kamathi's final notation captured the essence of their approach. We are not exploring space. We are exploring the nature of possibility itself. As the vessel prepared to traverse its first interstellar boundary, something extraordinary happened. The computational systems, the biological networks, the individual consciousnesses of both human and KFAX crew members began to resonate in a way that defied traditional understanding. They were becoming something new, something unprecedented. Not a defeat, not a victory. A conversation.